I'm Ashley, and today we're going to talk all about painting terminology specific to watercolor. So I know when I start a new hobby or am just trying to dive in, I like to know a little bit of the terminology because if I'm listening to or watching people trying to teach, we all use our jargon. And if I don't know what those words mean, then I have to step away from that mental place that I was in watching that and have to go research what this thing is, right? So this video is going to be all about just kind of basic terminology and regarding watercolor. So we're going to start off by talking about watercolor itself. So watercolor is a type of paint. So that's kind of the simple version of it, right? And paint has pigments and binders. So the pigment is actually the colored part of the paint, and the binder is what you mix the pigment with, which is usually like a powder or ground substance to make it liquid, okay? So in watercolor, the binder is typically gum arabic. It can be different things, but typically it's gum arabic, and sometimes Daniel Smith uses honey in their mixture as well, but it can vary, but it's the actual fluid substance that the pigment particles are suspended in. And the pigments are wide variety. So they can be natural pigments, which are usually stones or types of earth materials that are ground up into very fine particles, or they can be synthetic, which are lab made, right? So watercolor itself is a medium. So in art, there are different mediums, and that's what you're actually using to create the artwork. So watercolor is one, acrylic is another, you can use ink, you can use gouache, oil, all of these are mediums. So you can also do mixed media. So if you're doing mixed media, you might mix your watercolor paints with ink and do an ink and wash style painting, or you can do collage, or you can do, layering with watercolor and gouache and ink and oils or whatever you want to mix, right? It's up to you. You're the artist. And that's called mixed media. And then if you're just using one, then, it'd be called a watercolor painting versus mixed media. So really, it doesn't matter. Again, you're the artist, choose whatever you want. But if you're going to show or compete or anything with your art, sometimes there are specific guidelines that say that they can't be mixed media. So in that sense, even something as simple as a line and wash painting where it's all watercolor with just some ink lines, that would not be allowed in one of those type of shows where it has to be a single media. But in general, do what you want, mix whatever you want, and play with it. So for watercolor specifically, they come in a ton of different varieties. So kind of traditionally, they come in tubes or in pans. And so these are pan paints. Sorry, this is super messy, but this is pans, and they just come in these little, this is a quarter pan, these little plastic or metal pans, and then they get filled with watercolor. You can buy them like this, or you can fill them yourself, and there's different sizes. This is a quarter, there's half pans, and there's full pans. So you can find those on online if you're going to fill your own, or if you're buying a pan set, it'll designate what size pans they have. Both of these are traditional watercolor. So the tube is liquid and the pan is basically just liquid that was poured in a pan and then set to dry or cure for a period of time depending on the brand. But they're the same paint usually. Some brands have slightly different formulations for their pans versus their tubes, just so that they cure a little bit better, don't crack, whatever, when they're going into the pans. But in general, it's the same paint. Watercolor can also come in sticks or crayon form. So this is a water-soluble pastel. Okay, so this is a Caran d'Ache, that's upside down, a Caran d'Ache Neocolor 2. And these are one of the most popular brands of the water-soluble wax pastels, but that's essentially a watercolor crayon. They also come in pencil form. So this is a watercolor pencil. Same idea. The inside is pigment, or is essentially paint that you can activate with water. They have watercolor pencils that the whole pencil is watercolor. It doesn't have the wood around it like a traditional pencil. So that's just another option. We have liquid watercolors. And so this usually comes with like a dropper, and it's very, very watery. So even more watery than a tube paint. So that's a liquid watercolor right there. Okay. There are watercolor markers or like brush pens. So I have some of those right here. This is a watercolor brush pen. So it's got this brush tip and it's flexible and it's just filled with watercolor paint basically. So it's easy to take on the go. These ones are Chromatech, but there's lots of different variants of those as well. Okay, what other forms of watercolor are there? I guess that's it. So those are all I can think of, but there's tons of different forms. They're all very similar, but there are some benefits and drawbacks. Like tubes aren't the best to travel with because what are you going to do with the wet paint after you squeeze it out? You can't put it back in, right? Pans are really nice to travel with because you can store them in a travel palette and just close it up and take it on the go. So that's a really nice way to travel. A lot of people like to throw some of the watercolor crayons or watercolor pencils, that fell on the ground, or markers into their bag because they don't have to be, like even pans, after you use them, you really should kind of let them dry out a little bit before you close it. You don't have to, but you should if you're not using it consistently, especially because it could mold if you close it wet and then just leave it there. If you're using it again later that day or the next day, it probably won't mold. But your crayons, your pencils, your markers aren't going to have that same drawback as even the travel palettes. So they're a little bit more on the go friendly, we'll say. So I'm gonna pick that up now. Okay, so then we get into the watercolor itself. I already talked about pigments and binders. So pigments are going to be designated on the tubes. So if you look, or on your pans, they come with covers that, and usually like a card that describes everything. But if you look at a tube of watercolor, it's going to have a lot of different information on it. So on the front, it's going to have the name, it's going to have the brand of the watercolor. This is Winsor & Newton. It has the size of the tube there. They come in a lot of different sizes. So this one is 37 milliliters or 14 milliliters or 5 milliliters. That's the sizes that Winsor & Newton comes in, but it'll tell you that. And then it'll have usually like a professional quality rating. So on Winsor & Newton, they have the series numbers and then the permanence ratings. So we'll get into that in a minute. But in terms of the pigment, that's going to be on the back. So on the Winsor & Newton tubes, it's right there on the back. There's information about the pigments, okay? So on this one, this is burnt sienna, and it says the pigment is PR 101. So all of the pigments start with P, and then the letter after designates the color or like the color family that it is. So if you look at this one, it's PR, that's a red, okay? The yellow ochre, it's PY, and that is a yellow. This one's sap green, and it's PY and PG. So this has got two different pigments in it. Okay, so all of them are going to have that. So you have yellow, violet, blue, brown, black, and so they all are going to be designated that way. And then the numbers after that are, it's kind of like a system, right? So P is pigment, The letter is the color family, and then the number is the actual pigment itself. And those are going to be fairly consistent across brand, because something like cobalt blue is generally going to be the same pigment number across brands. Now, the way that they treat the pigment is different, so it can actually have a different appearance, but even if it is the same number. So just know that, you know, different brands are treating things differently, and it can look different even if it's the exact same pigment number, depending on how it's treated. But at least you'll get a general idea of what that pigment is. So that information is directly on the tube or on the cards or on the covers that come on the pans. So you can have all that information at your fingertips or on the websites for these paint brands or paint makers. One thing to know is on professional grade watercolors, you're pretty much going to be able to find all that information. On student grade, often you will, but not always. And on like craft grade or like even lower than student grade, you probably won't find pigment number information, but you might. The other thing to know is that the pigment numbers might be exactly the same for two different colors. So take burnt sienna, for example. Burnt sienna and raw sienna are gonna have the same pigment number usually, but one of them, the pigments were actually burnt, hence the name, and it changes, it causes that chemical reaction and actually changes the color. I don't know if you did chemistry in high school and burned different metals and stuff to see what color they burn, but it actually changes the chemical composition of the pigment and therefore results in a different color. So just, interesting little science fact. Now, some people prefer to find single pigment formulations. So again, like this burnt sienna, it's PR 101. And it's just one pigment. So that's a single pigment formulation. And then this sap green has more than one pigment in it. So it has a yellow and a green. So some people prefer their paints to just have one pigment number in them because in theory, the fewer pigments that you mix, the more pure a color is going to be and the less muddy. Okay. Muddy is a very subjective term, but muddy colors are when things start mixing too much and it just kind of gets to be this like icky, dull color. And so if you're mixing single pigment formulas instead of multiple pigment formulas, you're controlling how many pigments are in a mix more than if you're mixing multi-pigment formulas. Now, personal preference, play with your mixtures. Some of my favorite mixtures are from multi-pigment formulas. So it doesn't matter really, but just something to be aware of. Some purists might say that you really should only use single pigment formulations or something. You do what you want. If you like a color, get it. But just know that if you start mixing that with other colors, it might turn a little bit more dull, less vibrant, and muddy. If you have a preference on single pigment versus multi-pigment, I'd love to hear in the comments. So if you prefer single pigment formulas, put a 1 in the comments. And if you don't care and you just like all the colors, put a ampersand in the comments. I don't know if I'm saying that right. It's this symbol right here. You can also correct me if I'm saying it wrong, but I'd love to kind of get an idea if people care or not. So another thing that we can talk about with information that's on the watercolor tube is light fastness. So light fastness is the permanence basically of a watercolor in relation to how it tolerates exposure to light. So for your professional watercolors, it should tell you on the website or on the tube or in the information sheet that comes with your pans about the light fastness ratings. So for Winsor & Newton, they don't specifically say light fast on their tubes, but they have a permanence rating. And so the permanence rating is kind of equal-ish to light fastness. It's not exactly the same, but it gives you an idea of the light fastness. So that's on the front of their tubes. And so like this one is permanence A, and A is the best for them. So then you have so that's burnt sienna. you have a color that is notorious for fading. People love to talk about how Opera Rose is not light fast. So if you look at that tube, it has a permanence rating of B. So they have A, AA, and B. And so B is not great, but it's still considered a professional watercolor. It's just something to know if you are going to be painting and you want them to last a long time and you're going to be actually displaying them. You probably want to do a lot more UV protection on something that you're using not permanent watercolors, or you might want to avoid the not permanent watercolors. If you're going to be making prints or copies of them, like for example, you're doing a card and you're going to then scan it and make copies of it, the light fastness isn't going to matter because you're not actually displaying the original piece. So it's something to keep in mind. Now, I personally have not done any type of light fastness testing. There are a lot of people who do light fastness tests, and you can find different videos of that if you're interested in seeing how the colors shift over time, or you can do your own. Just paint some swatches, cover half of it with tape, stick it in a window. The part that's not covered will fade or be exposed, and the part that is covered won't, and you can test it for 2 months or whatever you want, and then look at the differences. A lot of people do that though, and you can find those results if you want. I just kind of trust what it says on the tube. Another thing with watercolors is that they're usually fairly transparent. So that's one of the things with watercolor paints is you can thin them out with water and do really transparent washes so that the underlayers or the white of the paper shines through the paint and really gives it that luminous effect. So your watercolors are going to have opacity ratings. So whether it's opaque, semi-opaque, or transparent. So on most watercolors, it's going to be a square that's either going to be filled, half filled, or not filled. So for this one, it's not filled. That means it's a transparent paint. Whereas this one, which is yellow ochre, it's half filled. And so this is a semi-opaque. So it's not going to be as transparent or luminous as your transparent colors. Some benefits of that is you can layer it over a little bit easier. So generally you have to paint light to dark in watercolors, but if you're using an opaque watercolor, you can kind of use it in mass tone, which is just a really thick, like fresh version, not lots of water. And you can layer lighter colors over darker if they're opaque. It's not going to be the same effect as layering oil or acrylics over. It's still going to have some transparency, but it's going to be at least doable with a more opaque paint. And then you have like this one, which is a solid box. That means that this is considered to be an opaque watercolor. And this is something cobalt green deep. And so that's considered to be an opaque watercolor. You can still shear it out and make it fairly transparent. So here's my swatch sheet for this. And you can see down here at the bottom, if it focuses, I don't know if it's focusing. Anyway, we'll just come back here. It doesn't want to focus, but that's okay. So it shears out. Okay. So, but in masked tone, it's very opaque. There's also on Winsor & Newton this, which is a box with a line through it that doesn't have either side filled in. And that means it's semi-transparent. To be honest, semi-transparent, semi-opaque. Very similar to me, but I guess it's a little bit more transparent than a semi-opaque. But I don't know. I haven't seen very many of those. Staining is another property of watercolors that is talked about some. So with watercolor, sometimes we can lift the pigment back off the paper. Other times it will actually stain the paper versus just kind of laying on top of the paper. And so staining formulas are going to be harder to lift after laying them down than your non-staining formulas. So a time where you might do that, let me just grab a brush here. So let's say we want to paint a watercolor sky here. Okay, I'm gonna add some paint or add some water to my paper here. I don't want too much. This is very not textured paper, so. Okay, so I'm just gonna add some cobalt to this paper, okay? Now, let's say I want to lift away some of that to create a cloud, okay? I can take my brush and pick up some of that paint. And you can see how I just lifted up all of that blue off of the paper. It didn't stain the paper. Alternatively, I can use a towel or a paper towel and lift like that also, okay? After it's dry, you can also re-wet and lift some more. So that is lifting in very basic terms. But some paints are not going to do that as well as others. So some paints will really stain the paper, whereas others, you might be able to kind of almost erase them completely. So if I take some clean water and then my towel and just dab this paper, you can see that pretty much all of that blue is gone, okay? So that is not staining the paper. Other paints will stain the paper. So just know that, and that's not on a lot of the tubes. It's on some of the tubes, but it's not on all of the tubes. Usually you can find that information on their websites or on like a dot card. This is a dot card, and a dot card is just kind of like a sample card with little dots of paint that you can activate and test out. And on the dot card, this is a Daniel Smith dot card. On the bottom, it gives you a key to what all of the information below the pigments means. So on this Daniel Smith one, we have our light fastness ratings, our staining or non-staining, our granulation, transparency, and then the series. So we already talked about light fastness. So if you look through these, a 1 is excellent, 2 very good, 3 fair, right? So we have all of these. And if you look through these, pretty much all of these are a 1. There's a 2 right there. But these are all pretty high light fastness. Then you look at staining or non-staining. So on this one, a 1 is non-staining, a 4 is highly staining, and then 2 and 3, right? So you see a lot more variety there. We have 1s that are not staining. You have a 2 here, so that's lightly staining. Quinacridone, Imperial Purple is a 2. Quinacridone Rose is a 3. So these 3s, and if there are any 4s, are going to stain more than your 1s, okay? And then this also has transparency on it, which we talked about already. So your transparency on the Daniel Smith one is a circle instead of a square, but the same exact idea. Empty, a half filled, or a completely filled circle, which on this dot card, I don't see any opaque, completely filled circles. It doesn't matter. It still has the information down here. So also know that lifting is going to depend on your paper. So like this paper, it's really smooth, and it's cellulose. So you saw I could just erase it completely. Not all papers are going to lift that easy, but paper is a whole different topic that we're not going to get into right this second. So just know some papers are going to lift easier than other papers, and that's something that you can test out if you are wanting to look through that. But in general, your non-cotton papers are going to lift a lot easier than your cotton papers. That's kind of very brief, not in-depth information about that. Okay, for the next topic, I'm getting a piece of watercolor paper that is more textured than the one that I have on my desk right here. So this one is on one side a cold press. I have some old art on this, but on one side it's more cold press. On the other side it's really smooth, which is more hot press texture. Again, paper is a whole different conversation, but the more textured it is, the more that the paint and water are going to kind of seep into it, and the more certain effects are going to show up. That's why I'm switching to this one. because we're going to talk about granulation next. So granulation, again, if you look at the dot card, like this one just says no or yes for granulation. So some colors are going to granulate and others will not. Granulation is the separation of the pigment colors and kind of settling of it in different concentrations. So it looks like grainy on the page. That's why it's called granulation. And certain watercolors granulate, others do not. And this information is going to be on like your dot cards or on their websites. Sometimes it's on the tubes, but I haven't seen it much. So you might need to go on their website and designate until you kind of figure out which ones are granulating. So like on my swatch sheet for my palette that I set up for my desk, I wrote which ones are granulating on here. So we're going to show you kind of what that means. So I'm going to add like a little puddle of water here to the corner of my paper. And then we're going to put 2 different blues in this puddle. Okay, so I'm going to get Windsor blue and put that up here. And then I'm going to get ultramarine blue and put it down here. Okay, and I literally just put like a giant puddle of paint or of water on the paper. Okay, and then we're going to do another puddle here, and I'm going to mix ultramarine with burnt sienna. Okay, and it's going to create a gray. And then you're going to see as it dries what happens with these colors. Add a little bit more to it. Make it a little bit darker. Go. Okay, now we just have to let that dry. But do know that this is also going to be dependent on the paper that you use. Because if you use a smoother paper, the separation isn't going to be as obvious as if you use a more textured paper. And that's because of our next point. So sedimentation. Sedimentation is the actual settling of those particles into the valleys on the watercolor paper. So again, if it's textured, it's going to have kind of little mountains or hilltops and little valleys in between the textures. And the heavier pigment particles are going to settle down off of those little hills into the valleys. And that's going to create more of that separation look. So if you have a more textured paper, you're going to have a little bit better luck forcing that granulation to happen versus if you have a smooth paper. So I'm just going to add a little bit more of these colors in here, just kind of mixing them on the paper for my mixed version here. Okay, while this is drying, I'm going to take a super short break because my camera overhead is overheating. So I need to take a little break, let that cool down, and then we'll come back, look at these dry, and continue. Okay, so here we have our granulation. So we have our mixture here, which when we laid it down, pretty much just looked gray. And now you can see the blue and the brown of the ultramarine and the burnt sienna separating. So that's what happens when you mix like granulating colors, is that they don't maintain that nice even wash. If that's what you're looking for, I say nice. They actually separate, which creates a lot of interest. So it depends what you're going for. And then on our kind of just washes, there's not as much of a difference that you can tell. But this one, it's, you know, right here, you can tell it's nice and smooth. There's not any like changes or variations there. Here there is a little bit, and that's just because of how I put the watercolor on. Whereas this one, you can see little white spaces in the midst of the blue. Those white spaces are where the peaks are coming up on the watercolor paper, and the pigment has settled down in the little valleys, and that's why you're seeing the white spaces there. So it can create interest in your washes. But granulation is something that you kind of want to have an idea about, because if you're going for a very smooth green color, for example, you don't really want to mix a granulating blue in with a yellow, because it's going to separate and you're still going to see those speckles of blue and speckles of yellow, which is not a bad thing unless that's just not what you're going for, and then it is a bad thing, right? So just know that if you want a smooth mixture, you're going to want to mix non-granulating colors. Okay, then we get into kind of our next two terms. We have diffusion and we have wicking. So I'm going to put some water on the paper here. Okay, this is just clean water. And then we're going to drop some color into that. Okay, now the color moving through the water is called diffusion. Okay, so if you want that like soft diffused edge look, then you're going to do wet on wet, which is what we just did. We did a wet background and put wet paint on it. Now, wicking it's similar, but it's actually how the paper takes the color. So the paper can take the color and kind of pull it into those fibers. So on a textured paper, you're going to see that it doesn't get a very straight, smooth edge. Even when you're doing wet on dry. So this is dry paper right here, and I'm going to lay down some color. That was not very much. Okay. And the edges are still a little bit jagged, and that's because the paper is wicking the pigment and the binder and the paint into its fibers. Okay, so diffusion is how the paint reacts in water. Wicking is how the paint reacts to the paper fibers. And then another thing that you might hear is tinting strength. So different paints are going to be different like strengths, or you might hear like taking over the mix. So some colors are really strong and bold, and other colors are just a little bit weaker. And so if we mix two of those colors and we are thinking we're putting the same amount in each mixture, then it might turn out to be really heavily one color. So like Payne's Gray is one that just really takes over a mixture. So if I'm just activating my Payne's Gray here. Okay. So if I take some sap green, okay, and I put that here in the well, okay, I'm getting a decent amount. Now, if I take just a touch of Payne's Gray and mix that together, it changes it a lot. So it goes to Payne's Gray a lot sooner than it would go to sap green. So like now look, I have to add so much sap green back in to take it back to the sap green color. Okay, so Payne's Gray has a lot stronger tinting strength. Now, it doesn't have to be a darker color to be a stronger tinting strength. It can be a lighter color. So like your yellow ochre is going to be usually a little bit stronger than some of your other colors. So let's mix yellow ochre and permanent rose. My permanent rose is not activated. So I just put a ton of water in there. You transfer some of that water back out. Okay. So if I get my permanent rose there and take some yellow ochre, you can see how quickly that changes it toward the yellow ochre color. So I don't know this for sure, but I would think that your more opaque paints are going to be usually a stronger color in the mix, so have a higher tinting strength than your more transparent paints. But that, I don't know that I've actually seen that stated anywhere. That's just kind of what I'm thinking. It makes sense. So it's something that you just have to kind of play with your mixtures and get to know your paints and get to know what mixes you like, and then the feel for how much of each of those you're putting into the mix. Okay, so then we talked about a lot of different things here today about watercolor paint and kind of the different properties of it and the different terminology around it. We mentioned the binder. So I'm gonna open one of my paints here and see. Let me change the settings really quick on here. Okay, so if you look in this paint tube, okay, and I start to squeeze it, I gotta be very careful because I'm not looking at it. If you look at that, it looks like there's a little bubble coming out. That's the binder. Okay, so a lot of times in the tubes, the binder separates, and you kind of, when you squeeze out some paint into a pan or a well, the paint is separated. So you can kind of massage the tube a little bit to remix it, or take a toothpick and spin it in there, or just squeeze out enough and then mix it in the well to reconstitute your mixture. Or I mean, I guess I assume you could probably like shake it hard enough to mix it, like they do with the commercial paints where they're shaking them to mix it. But I don't know how hard you'd have to shake it. But just know that that's not a sign of a poor quality tube of paint. Okay, these are professional grade watercolors, and they do that. The Daniel Smith watercolors do that. They just separate in the tube, and you have to reconstitute them. And that's because the binder is actually floating in that binder. The pigment is floating in the binder, and it's not dissolved in like, you know, salt water, how it dissolves and you can't separate it until you evaporate it out. It's actually a mixture. So you just got to remix it. So not a big deal. But when we're mixing paints, another term is called mulling. And that's the process of actually mixing the pigment and the binder. And so I'm going to point you to a little video. This is not my video, but it's just a nice demonstration of this mixing. But you take, it's like mulling spices, where you crush the pigment and then keep going until it's a nice smooth blend. So I'll put a link to a video of that in the description if you're interested in seeing what that looks like. But that's the process of mixing the paint. Okay, so that's all I have for today in terms of like watercolor painting terminology. I really appreciate you spending your time watching this video. I really hope you learned something. If you did, go ahead and like the video because that'll help out my channel. You can share it if you think somebody's interested in this. And then subscribe to my channel for lots of content, a lot of tutorials. So if you're interested in tutorials, you can check out my channel. And if there are any other terms that you've run across that I didn't get to in this, go ahead and drop that in the comment as well, because I can always make a version 2 or a second follow-up to this video with a lot of different other terminology. We'll get into techniques, brush strokes, that kind of thing coming up soon. I'm going to make a video on that. So this was kind of just terminology basics, and then we'll get into those techniques in our next video. And again, just thank you so much for watching, and I hope you have an awesome day.